So welcome back, Cory. Recording is now in progress, so I think it's time to start. So, Cory, look forward to what you have to present this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Darren. It's really a delight to be back with you all again, and look forward to having the opportunity to share this time together. And I see my picture quality isn't the best. I hope that won't be too much of a distraction to you. I've been having a little bit of trouble getting the lighting under control here in the space in which I find myself. So I hope you can bear with me through that. I was sharing with the team before the session got underway that today is actually the 25th wedding anniversary for my wife and I. And so we've been having a great day here, and I'll share this time with you and then get back to spending time with my lovely bride. So, but glad that we could share some time together in the course of this day. I wanted in this session to invite you to take a little trip with me, and a trip to the future. And I imagine that somehow I developed the powers of time travel and travel 25 years into the future to visit the congregation that I currently serve. And as I come to the church, many things have changed visibly, but as I encounter the pastors who happen to be there conducting their staff meeting, I begin to engage them in conversation. And then in the course of conversation, I ask them in a moment of curiosity about the shape of the future. So what do you all think about this whole intergenerational ministry concept? And after an awkward pause, they look at me with this quizzical look, kind of like, well, what are you talking about? Well, of course we do intergenerational ministry. We don't even call it that anymore. We just call it church. And then they begin to take me on a little tour around the church and introduce me to all of the ways in which intergenerational ministry has become an integral, in fact, a natural part of the way that they are churched together. I want to reflect a little bit on my church during this session and the journey that we're on. Certainly, we're not there yet. And so it leaves me with the questions as we seek to lead the process of change in the church environment in which I find myself. What are some of the crucial things that I need to attend to as a leader in order to help that possible future out there 25 years from now to be reality? Obviously, there's a lot of space between the here and there and many factors that are beyond my control. But if as a leader, in how I'm leading presently, I have any influence in helping to contribute to the formation of that future, what are some of the things that I should be striving to be about and to be paying attention to? So I'm going to queue up my PowerPoint here, and we will walk through some things together. Okay, so to begin, that question then that I find myself asking as a leader in the environment where I serve, in which I think is an appropriate question for all of us as we seek to give leadership to the process of change that enables our churches to become more intentionally intergenerational, is this: what must we attend to as we navigate the challenges of leading our churches towards becoming more intentionally intergenerational? And during this brief time that we have together, I want to just introduce you to a few of the major overarching themes that I find myself striving to pay attention to and to grapple with as a leader within the life of my own congregation. And I want to just briefly survey four key areas or four key categories that I think are really important as we think about helping to nurture change within our congregations. So the first, if we phrase it in the form of question, is what sort of posture and processes should guide our approach to change? What sort of posture and processes should guide our approach to change? I think we recognize that we can adopt any of a number of different kinds of postures towards change, where we're going to try to make it happen. We're going to take this hill, or we're going to die trying, or any of a number of different ways of approaching change that we might envision. And of course, there are a number of processes that we might adopt as well to help to encourage and to facilitate change in the environments where we're leading. And I believe that two keys, as we think about the posture that we adopt towards change and the processes that we adopt to bring about change, these two keys are the wisdom of adapting and the wisdom of appreciating. So as I think about my own congregation, I recognize that the idea of being an intentionally intergenerational church has been for us a paradigm shift. When I arrived at my congregation 8 years ago, they were just beginning to explore some new possibilities about bringing people of different ages together after a protracted season in the history of the church's life, where they, in a very intentional way, had segregated the generations from one another. In fact, Sunday morning was shaped in such a way that there were 4 different services that took place on our church property, 2 at the 9 o'clock hour, 2 at the 11 o'clock hour, and they were all segregated according to age. That was partly by design and partly by default, as like was attracted to like. And this became the status quo for many years. Meanwhile, our children, during the services, went to full service kids ministry. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of the manifold ways in which the life of our congregation, there had been a paradigm that had really become ensconced, that had the generations separated from one another. And so as we began to embark on a process of change in our environment that we're still very much on, it's a recognition that we are in the midst of a paradigm shift of moving from one established way of doing things and then encountering its limitations and beginning to move towards a new way of doing things. And as I kind of hinted at there in my opening imagining of the future, my dream is that we all find ourselves navigating a paradigm shift of doing and being church in such a way that a couple of decades from now, we will not find it necessary to speak about being intergenerational churches in the same way that we are currently, with the same degree of specificity, because we're trying to be so intentional about embedding this change within the life of the church, but where it would become so natural that it would simply just be another way of saying church, so that intergenerational church essentially becomes a redundant term. Well, we're nowhere near that, and that's not going to be our reality anytime soon. But I dream of the other side of this paradigm shift, where we encounter those and say, intergenerational church, they say, yeah, duh, and one congregation that I did a study of within my own city here a couple of years ago, they are already beginning to see evidence of that, where they're finding that their kids are growing up in an environment where intergenerational is such a natural part of their experience of church that they simply don't know that there is another way. And that's that future that I find myself dreaming of. Here in our North American context, I don't know as much in the Australian and New Zealand context, if this is something that you can identify with, but in the North American context, as was true in the life of our church, our modern experience has been shaped by this notion that birds of a feather flock together. And within the life of the church, this became embedded in our consciousness in such a way that we really bought into this notion that if you want to grow, that if you want to reach people, that if you want to succeed as a church, that you have to embrace this principle and that you have to exploit this principle. And it's become the prevailing paradigm. It has shaped our imagination. It has defined our categories of success. It has provided for us our notions about what's possible and about what's best. And of course, here in the North American environment, with all of our nonprofit organizations and our big conferences and our publishing houses and our Christian broadcasting corporations, there has been an entire Christian industrial complex that has been focused on providing us guidance about how to get there within that way of viewing and approaching things. And so intergenerational is for us a paradigm shift. And we would believe that it's not just something novel, but it's actually something quite ancient. And hopefully I'm not being overly dramatic when I draw parallels to Ezra and the rediscovery of the scrolls, that we feel like we are tapping into something ancient here, that it was part of the founding vision that God had in mind for God's people in the first place. But still, for those of us who are situated in the 21st century world in which we find ourselves, it's new to us. And so perhaps it's not surprising that we encounter some resistances to this kind of change. It's something that, frankly, we can expect, where there might even be some who say, wait, that's not practical. That doesn't work. And sometimes we can even encounter those resistances within ourselves. And so for me, as a leader within my congregation, as we are on this journey of change, of trying to move from what was to this future that we're trying to embrace, I found it really helpful to be guided by this distinction that likely isn't new to you between technical challenges or technical changes and adaptive challenges or adaptive changes. Technical challenges are those where there is clear definition and available solutions that are provided by the existing order of things. We could describe this as tinkering changes. Basically, the system that we have in place, it largely works. And it's just about some fine-tuning, some tinkering to make the changes that are necessary to make the system maybe a little bit better in some way. Adaptive challenges, adaptive changes, on the other hand, are being ushered into something new, uncharted territory for us, where there aren't any solutions that are immediately apparent within the existing system. It requires us to learn our way into a new way of being, a new way of behaving, a new set of attitudes and ways of being oriented to things, new values. I've described this in a chapter that I wrote for the precursor to the Engage All Generations book that Darren was highlighting moments ago, the Intergenerate volume that was published in 2018 that was based upon presentations given at the inaugural Intergenerate conference in Nashville in 2017. I compared it to Abraham's journey, when the Lord says to Abraham, I'm sending you to a land that you don't yet know. And for many of us, when we set out on this journey of adaptive change, of learning our way into something that, frankly, many of us haven't experienced before, being an intergenerational church, we are embarking on a journey towards a land that, frankly, many of us have never been to before. And so that is a journey that requires the process of learning and of discovery. And so I'm helped in this by thinking in terms of the approach to change that's outlined by the anthropologist Everett Rogers in his book, Diffusion of Innovation. And in it, he talks about how, change doesn't happen whole hog all at once. We can't expect the whole system to change all at once. And then, in fact, when we approach to bring about that kind of wholesale systemic change, when we're seeking to do something that is adaptive in nature, that it's destined to fail. And that's important for us to appreciate, because I trust that you and I have prioritized carving out time to be part of something like this, because we want the kind of change that we find not only in the church structure, not only in the weekly calendar, but in people's hearts, in our own hearts. Others have to have a chance to observe and to decide that the alternative future that is being presented by the kind of change that we're advocating for is something that is preferable to the status quo with which they've been acquainted. And so Everett Rogers helps us to appreciate that the way that change actually happens in environments where we need to change the culture isn't entirely unlike what Jesus says when he says, that it's just about introducing a little bit of yeast into the dough, and that with time, that yeast works its way through the whole dough. And so I have come in my own leadership to envision the kind of change that we're trying to bring about in our environment, about introducing a little bit of yeast into the dough and being intentional about working with it and trusting that with time, as we are intentional, as we're present, as we're faithful, that yeast, it's going to work its way through the whole dough. Everett Rogers says that really it's about beginning with the coalition of the willing. Those people who he describes as the innovators, these are the people who already had a desire for the kind of change that we're talking about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. They already are clued into this. They already carry it in their hearts. And there's already an eagerness in them to take an active role in being a part of the kind of change. These folks, if you see the graphic on the screen there, they represent a small percentage of our congregation, but the role that they can play is powerful in nature. There's another camp that follows closely on the heels of them that Rogers describes as the early adopters. And these might not be the folks who show up on the first Saturday, but these are the folks who will quickly be brought along because they have a predisposition towards trying something new, or perhaps towards the kinds of things that we're talking about and envisioning. And so it's about beginning with those who are ready to come along in a process of experimentation, of reflection, of learning, and then sharing our stories with the broader congregation about what we're learning through those experiences as we are engaging in these little experiments in intergenerational life. And in our congregation, we've been guided by the understanding that sometimes it's better to start change at the margins and to work from there towards the center, introducing the yeast at the edges and working towards the center, rather than a full frontal attack on the center of the church's life, the place that people value most, which is most likely to elicit a response of resistance and even outright rejection. And so for me, as we've begun to undertake these little experiments in intergenerational life and invite people into these experiments and learn together and reflect together and then share the stories with others about what we're experiencing, then others come along. And with time that we see those numbers grow. This graphic that you see here actually comes from a chapter that was written by Jim Merhot in the Engage All Generations book, and he unpacks the way that this worked in a congregation that he served, a Catholic parish in Ohio. And it was a story of change that is heartening and inspirational. But for me as a leader, I find relief in the sense of permission that this provides me. A sense of relief that alleviates for me the pressure to change everything all at once. Because frankly, if I'm being honest with you, as a leader, I don't possess the power to bring about that change everything at once kind of outcome anyhow. And frankly, I don't possess the genius to make it happen either. But in beginning with the coalition of the willing, and engaging in a journey together of experimentation and discovery, it enables us to work together at working the yeast through the dough of our congregation. It means that change doesn't look like a beeline straight from point A, where we are presently, to point B, this envisioned future. Rather, it's a journey of discovery that emerges as we travel along the path with all of its twists and its turns, but it enables us to have this change embedded in our culture and embedded in our hearts. And so for those of us who maybe struggle with a sense of paralysis about how do we begin the process of change, I think that an approach of an adaptive vision of change moves us from paralysis to permission. But this question of what sort of posture and process should guide our approach to change also, I think, highlights the wisdom of taking a posture of appreciating. I've been really influenced by the work of Mark Lowell Branson in his book, Memories, Hopes, Conversations, in which he takes a particular approach to strategic change called appreciative inquiry, and he translates it into the life of the church. And he actually tells the story of the first Japanese American Presbyterian church of Altadena, California, and how they used this approach of appreciative inquiry to catch a renewed vision of what it was that God wanted to do within their congregation. And appreciative inquiry is an approach to change that assumes that all organizations have these significant life forces. These forces are these sources of energy and of life and of vitality that are embedded in the history of the church. We find evidence of them in the stories that are told, and the artifact that we find of the significant things that have happened in the life of the church in the past. And so it helps us envision change, not just as about boldly ushering in a never before seen future, which some of us are perhaps a little prone to, as though we ride into town on our white horse and we say everything that has been prior to my arrival here as a leader is inherently inferior. A new day has dawned. But rather, it helps us to look at the histories of our congregations and say, what has already gone on here that is a sign of life that we can perhaps, like a good archaeologist, dig up and dust off and reappropriate as a way to help cast vision, to say that God has been at work here. And just as we have been these kind of people in the past, we can be these kind of people again. And for me as a leader, stepping into a congregation that is now 120 years old, it was important for me not to come riding into town on my white horse, saying that everything that has happened has been inherently inferior, but rather to look for those evidences that are embedded in the past of my congregation, that God has been at work here. And so even though we can speak about this kind of change towards becoming intentionally intergenerational as a paradigm shift, at the same time, even as my church had been in a very intentional way cultivating this multi-generational approach to structuring ministry, I still can identify these life-giving stories of intergenerational connection happening, even in the midst of all of that. And I can point to those stories, and I can say, yes, those are the stories that illustrate for us what we're talking about. This is good stuff here, folks. This is what we strive to be and to be more of. And I know that for many of us, if you are serving in a smaller congregation or a smaller parish, I know that sometimes in smaller churches, there can be a temptation to fall prey to something of an inferiority complex. We recognize that within the Christian world, that all of the models that are held up for us, all of those who have the light kind of shone upon them as the champions among us, tend to be the bigger churches. But the Fuller Youth Institute and the research that they did on what's happening with youth and young adults, they found that the churches that actually had a distinct advantage in creating the kind of connections between generations that we're talking about in this conference tended to be the churches of 300 people or less, because they structure their church life in ways that just frankly lends themselves more naturally towards these kinds of connections happening. And so I want to say to you that if you are serving in a smaller congregation or a smaller parish, that if you use these sorts of appreciative lenses, I suspect that you can see evidences of these kinds of connections happening even somewhat naturally around you. And this is is a resource that we can use in advocating for change, of shining the light on these evidences of intergenerational vitality happening in our midst and saying, folks, this is what we're talking about. Let's strive to be more like this. And so no need for an inferiority complex. In this respect, those of us who perhaps have deemed ourselves last could actually be first when it comes to fostering these kinds of intergenerational connections. Well, secondly, I think an important question for us to attend to as we strive to foster this kind of change and help our churches become more intentionally intergenerational is the question of what resources do we have at our disposal to persuade and to provoke others to embrace this change. And in this category, I think it's helpful for us to think about the power of artifacts and the power of anecdotes. And so I'll unpack here briefly what I mean by these two categories. Artifacts, there's a word that I gained from a book called Culture Making by Andy Crouch. He's an author, and this is one particular book by Andy Crouch that has been really influential in my life and in my thinking. And in this book, Andy Crouch sets out to explore how we change culture. And he defines culture as what we make of the world. And obviously, culture is very complex. And there's much more to be said about that. The time just simply doesn't afford us. But Crouch argues in his book that the way that we change culture is by making more of it. That we essentially create new forms of culture that people can embrace, that replaces the old. In a very real sense, he's talking about the same thing that Everett Rogers is talking about in our move from the old paradigm to the new paradigm. But when he talks about what we make of the world, Crouch uses this word artifacts to describe those things that we create. They are the tangible, observable expressions of underlying values and vision that we bring to the process of creating and shaping things. Artifacts are essentially the stuff that we make of the world. And all of the artifacts that we create are shaped by certain assumptions about the way that things are and the way that things should be. And this has significant implications for how we think about church structures, because frankly, the way that we structure our churches is it's in its own sense a type of artifact. It's something that we have made, and it has been shaped by a certain set of assumptions, a certain set of values and vision, notions about the way that things are, and notions about the way that things should be. And some of the models that have predominated within the life of the church that have been artifacts of the world of modernity have shaped churches in very much the way that my church was shaped, of slicing and dicing and siloing the generations into their own distinct programmatic experiences. And so part of what needs to happen is for us to be presented with viable artifacts, different possibilities shaped by different notions about the way things are, the way that things should be, different values, different vision that helps us really grasp onto what is possible here among us as we try to live into being intentionally intergenerational together. Now, some among us, amongst the crowd that are participating in this conference, have the kind of gifts and talents to shape and to create these new expressions of intergenerational life. Some of us, frankly, maybe we simply weren't outfitted by God with those gifts. Maybe we lack the imagination. And so it's important for us then to go and to collect those artifacts, to look for examples of practices and programs and approaches that others have developed that we could adopt, that we could experiment with our own environments, that would give us an opportunity to get in there and to try it for ourselves, by learning through implementing those frameworks that others have developed in other settings. And that's one of the things that's so valuable about gatherings like this is that it provides us exposure to some of those examples that we can learn from and that we can take back to our own environments. And we can try these things out for ourselves. And certainly the Engage All Generations book that Darren was highlighting at the beginning of our session is full of examples of these artifacts, of different approaches that folks have developed over time to shaping opportunities for intergenerational community. And so perhaps we set out to gather some of these for ourselves, not because we want to reduce intergenerational ministry to models or programs. Certainly, that's not the point, because these provide for us simply some tangible reference points that can help us and help those that we're trying to influence see what we mean when we talk about being intergenerational together. And then as we ask, what could we do here? It becomes helpful to us. I'm not a regular reader of the Harvard Business Review, but I did read an article from that periodical a number of years ago in which the author was reflecting upon this standard encouragement that sometimes we just need to get together and we need to think outside the box. And I imagine we could imagine ourselves doing that as we get key players in the room and say, all right, what are we going to do, folks? We want to try to engage in some intergenerational innovation here in our setting. Let's think outside the box. And this author points out that, frankly, some of us really struggle to think outside the box. And so this author was arguing that one of the functions of leadership is to draw the box, because frankly, some people need to have the box drawn before they are able to think outside of it. And so these artifacts, these examples, these models that we can gain at conferences like this, in reading books like Engage All Generations, in seeing what's exemplified by churches around us, it helps us draw the box so that we have somewhere to begin in our conversation. I see this modeled in the life of the church served by my friend Brian, who is a faithful Baptist pastor in a church in Illinois in the United States. A number of years ago, as they desired to begin to take first steps, they adopted the Logos program, which is run by Gen On Ministry. It's an intergenerational midweek program. For them, it was simply a place to begin. And over time, the growth of the influence of this intergenerational experiment has begun to take root within the life of their congregation so deeply, so powerfully, that now they're asking the question about how can we take what we've learned there and begin to implement it in other corners of the church's life and bring about more broad-based change so that we can continue to grow in becoming an intentionally intergenerational church. Artifacts can be helpful to us in that. But also, I think I see power in and I'm falling behind in my PowerPoint here, I'm sorry about that, in the role that anecdotes can play. I read a book a number of years ago by an author from California by the name of Steve Saccone. And in it, he is reflecting on what does it mean to be a relationally intelligent leader? That's a good question, I think, for all of us to ask. And one of the themes that he championed in one of the chapters of this book was, he said, relationally intelligent leaders, those who function well within a relational ecology in seeking to influence others and bringing about change, is that they are good story collectors. They're people who are paying attention to people's stories. They're listening keenly. They're gathering them, and they're remembering them. And they're recognizing the powerful role that the stories of what God is doing among us can play in being a resource to help to provoke and to persuade change within the life of the church. I'm really convinced that being a story collector plays a crucial role to bring about the kind of diffusion of innovation that I was reflecting upon just moments ago. It's a way for us to actually operationalize a commitment also to taking an appreciative posture of what God is already doing around us within the life of our church, to recognize those things that are already captured and embedded in the stories of the life of our church. And so as I look around me and my congregation, I can see all of the stories of how God is at work through the life of God's people, of bringing the generations together, and the stories of ways in which lives are being impacted through those connections. And as a leader, I seek to take note of those stories and to collect them. And I really am convinced that this adage, conversation creates culture, is a truth. And so if we can get talking about the stories about how God is at work among us, of bringing about this kind of change in people's lives, of intergenerational connection, that is going to impact our culture, that with time, it's going to change our culture. And I really believe in the pull of compelling accounts. And so I'm really trying in my own context to use this as a way of bringing about change in a variety of ways. I have looked for opportunities to share with my congregation from my own story, certainly, of how I have been impacted and continue to be impacted by intergenerational connection. And as I look at the life of my congregation, for a number of years, I have been using my pastoral column within our monthly church newsletter to write an article entitled Generations of Faith. And some months it's about casting biblical vision for intergenerational ministry. Some months it's devoted to talking about some of the initiatives that we're trying to foster within the life of the church. But the greater percentage of the time, I devote this column to actually going and listening to the stories of people in my congregation who are wrapped up in the intergenerational things that are going on, and to hear about what they're experiencing and the way that it's impacting them, and then to share that story with the broader congregation in hopes that it will just help, by the power of the Holy Spirit, a little yeast continue to work its way through the whole dough. So we can also pay attention to the stories of what we see happening in other congregations around us, other denominations. Let's pay attention to those compelling accounts of God at work around us. Thirdly, how do we describe the priorities and the patterns that will help others understand what it is that we're talking about when we talk about being intentionally intergenerational? Frankly, there are some among us who just aren't altogether sure what it is that we even mean when we talk about that. So what does that look like? What are we aiming for? And then what role does analytics play? How do we know when we're actually doing what we think it is that we mean to do? I was sharing in my session last night about the early days of the missional conversation here in North America, and it was being led by a group called the Gospel in Our Culture Network. And as the folks were coming together to talk about bringing about missional change within the church, the question was asked repeatedly, so what does this look like? In other words, as we talk about being missional, what should we be aiming for? What are the distinguishing marks that help us know if we're headed in the right direction? And so those who were playing a role in leading the charge with the Gospel in Our Culture Network, they heard the call in that question, and they set out to undertake a research project that they called Patterns of Missional Faithfulness, to see if they could identify the patterns that seemed to characterize churches that seemed in some way to be about this thing that we were calling missional. And in the early stages of this undertaking, they sensed that they were going to crack the code of what the model was, of what it meant to be missional. But they very quickly came to realize that it really wasn't about a model. It wasn't about a program, but that it was about patterns of a way of life, perhaps a set of practices, but patterns. And patterns, of course, for those of you who perhaps have some experience with sewing, you know that you can take a pattern and that you can cut it out of all kinds of different cloth. And they recognized that missional churches were cut out of all kinds of different cloth, but they seemed to be characterized by some consistent patterns that were applicable in different contexts. And so I think we find ourselves asking, what are the distinguishing marks of intergenerational life? Or what are the patterns of intergenerational faithfulness? I think that's an important question for us to ask, because it provides us some direction in what we think we mean when we talk about what we're aiming for in being more intentionally intergenerational. Some of you perhaps have become acquainted with the work of Joe Azzopardi, who is Canadian, but who calls Australia home these days and has settled into his role now as an associate pastor at a Seventh-day Adventist church in Brisbane. And in his doctoral work at the Seventh-day Adventist College there in Australia, he set out to address this very question. And I was privileged to serve as one of the readers for his doctoral dissertation. And he has a chapter in my earlier book called The Generative Church. I don't know if you can see that. It's kind of shiny, in which he outlines his findings about his answer to what he learned as he went poking around to try to discover what were these patterns that seemed to characterize faithfulness in churches that were striving to be intentionally intergenerational. And he found these 5 things: that they were churches where positive interactions were being fostered between the generations, where there were intentional efforts at connecting people of different generations, where with time there was a growing sense of interdependence between people of different generations, where they were contributing in such a way and participating together in such a way that they relied on one another and their presence mattered, and that if one generation was away perhaps at youth camp, that their absence was noted and felt, that they were churches where all generations were experiencing empowerment because they were gifted by the Holy Spirit. They also were empowered within the life of the church to be active contributors in the ministry of the church. And that these were environments where people of different generations, both younger and older, were actively willing to accommodate one another, to follow in the way of Jesus. And in Philippians chapter 2, of having the same mind in themselves that we see in Christ, who emptied himself and took the form of a servant for our sake, that they were willing to make lesser of themselves and to think more of one another. I saw this illustrated in the life of this church that I researched here in my own community here within the last couple of years, as they've been in a journey of becoming more intentionally intergenerational. They are making efforts at bringing generations together in this way. And I saw evidence of this as I interviewed one late 20s young man who came from a really happening Pentecostal church with loud music, who played drums in the worship team. And in the course of one of our interviews, he said, if it was up to me, we would pump up the volume in worship a whole lot more than we do, and we'd make it a lot more rocking. But then he said, but it's not about me. And he reflected on the ways in which they were trying to be a church in which it was an environment in which the generations could be for one another. And I saw in that evidence of precisely what Joe describes in his research, which I think begins to provide us hints that this was a congregation that was finding its way to live together into the patterns of intergenerational faithfulness. And our time is getting short here, but I do want to go. I'll also mention, just kind of quickly in passing here, that Joe also found that a mentoring culture really was kind of the secret sauce, if you will, of these churches that were striving to be intentionally intergenerational, that bringing people of different generations together in intentional mentoring relationships seemed to be really important and to play an important role. Now, another important question for us to be asking is the question of how do we assess whether we are actually doing these things? How do we evaluate that? If these are the things that we're aiming for, then how do we know that we've done it, that we're doing it? I shared that adage in my presentation yesterday, that we measure what we treasure. And so what are the things that we're treasuring that we want to pay attention to? The analytics, if you will, that we find ourselves measuring. A friend of mine who belongs to a big prominent Pentecostal denomination here in Canada was telling me recently that they have certain metrics that they value as a denomination that have a lot to do with hitting certain benchmarks of numerical growth and things of that sort. And that within their denomination, that this is taken so seriously that if you fail to meet these benchmarks, that it actually constitutes a basis for intervention. It's a criteria for determining who are the winners and who are the losers, and what gets celebrated. In recent decades, our churches have known what metrics matter. And here in North America, certainly we can point to butts, budgets, and buildings. The 3 Bs are the metrics that we've known are the metrics that matter. And we find ourselves now in a position where we're asking if intergenerational ministry is going to usher us into a different way of life that's guided by different values, different notions about the way things are and the way things should be, and that's guided by a different set of patterns of our understanding of what it means to be faithful to the purposes that God has for us. Then what are those things that we should be measuring? Reggie McNeil, in a book that he published a number of years ago, said, it's time to change the ministry scorecard. And so I really think that applies to us in this conversation, that as we think about becoming intentionally intergenerational, that we have to change the ministry scorecard. And I think the way that we evaluate within our churches has to be qualitative about the stories of what God is doing as much as quantitative. And I'm not going to answer that for us today. Frankly, I don't know that I have the answers, and certainly time doesn't afford us the opportunity to even attempt that. But I do want to leave you with this, that we must be intentional about talking about this around the leadership tables within our churches. Otherwise, we will simply default to the old assumed metrics that have guided us for so long. Then finally, very briefly, I want to just invite you to reflect on this question with me. Who are the partners and the promoters who will join us in this work? Recognizing, as Everett Rogers reminded us earlier in our session, that we can't do this alone. It's about a growing number of people who are joining the ranks of the coalition of the willing, who are coming on board, desiring to experiment, to learn, to embrace the culture change, and to become part of the yeast working its way through the whole dough. And I'm convinced that there is tremendous value in the allies among us and the advocates among us. So very briefly, again, Everett Rogers says it's about beginning with those who are already on board, and that with time, a growing number will join us. And you see that orange line represents that over time, there's the accumulated effect as more and more come on board of a greater measure of culture change within our congregations. And so within that, there are those who I identify as allies, and those who are advocates. I like to refer to them as our colleagues and our co-conspirators. Andy Crouch notes that even Jesus had his 3, he had his 12, he had his 120, which reminds us that we too can't do this on our own. So it invites us to ask, who else is on this team? Who are the people who are already living this? People who are curious, people who are investigating, people who are experiencing a stirring within their hearts. These are probably the innovators and the early adopters within the life of our congregation that we should invite to come along with us on this journey of change. Within my congregation, it began with some places like women of different generations deciding that they wanted to band together and to shape an intentionally intergenerational women's ministry, that brought women of different generations together on a monthly basis to share in community and to begin to foster intergenerational spiritual friendships. Or it began with women who didn't even know one another in different corners of the church's life, who had a shared dream of bringing people together in the kitchen to teach people how to make food that could provide for families in need, but that could also be intentional as a platform for bringing people of different generations together to work alongside one another and to build community together. These, for me, in my setting, have been some of the allies who have become key participants in the change that God is bringing about in our midst. So it invites us to be networkers who are looking for those who maybe there's someone over here who has a dream and someone over here who has a dream. And when we bring them together, new possibilities, new resources are released that can help to bring about the change in our environments. But also there are those advocates among us. This is a special brand of allies, those who have credibility, clout that they can expend strategically. They can validate the change. They're the ones who, when they speak, people listen. They say, this isn't crazy. They're people who can open doors of opportunity. And when they say, let's give this a try, people invest what they say with a lot of credibility. People who play a role in shaping the agenda and advancing the conversation. Well, my time is up. And so just to recap before we go to our groups, I want to just encourage you to be thinking within your own environments about the wisdom of adapting, the wisdom of appreciating, to be thinking within your own environments about the power of artifacts, the power of anecdotes, to be thinking in your own environments about the importance of knowing your aims and the importance of knowing your analytics, and within your own environments, the wisdom or the value, of allies and the value of advocates. We've moved through a lot here in fairly short order, but I think we're going to move to some group time. I hope I haven't robbed your group time too much, but I'd love in this time for you just to talk about what do you find most challenging as you think about bringing about this kind of change within the church? What perhaps are some resources, some artifacts that you have accessed that have been most helpful for you in bringing about this kind of change and advocating for this kind of changing, helping others understand what we're talking about? And how would you describe aims of intergenerational faithfulness in your environment? And who are perhaps some of the advocates and allies in your environment that you might invite along in this journey? Darren, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Yes, thank you, Cory. Once again, powerful. So much in there that we can think about, and some really constructive ways forward, which I am thinking are going to really take us forward. We need to think more about creativity and creating, not so much combating. I love that. It's going to help.